And this is part of our First Friday's Colloquium series, the first Friday of every month. And this month, we're very pleased to have Dr. Kristall J here to speak to us. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Educational Studies and an Ed TPA coordinator in the Office of Educator Preparation. She currently holds an Ohio license in special education, music education, as well, that's really cool, as well as a principal's license for grades 5 through 12. Her areas of expertise include applications of direct instruction, curriculum, and assessment for adolescents with disabilities, and self-management interventions for students with behavior disorders. And today, this afternoon, Kristall's going to be talking to us about content area vocabulary instruction for high school students with learning disabilities. So let's give Kristall a warm welcome.
Thanks.
And I'm going to stop you after 45 minutes for some questions.
Oh, okay.
So.
I'll try to get through it quickly. Okay.
We have a little time for questions.
Right. Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. This is quite an honor, and I feel really important after your introduction, so thank you. And thank all of you for being here today on a Friday afternoon in June. I know most of us are still recovering from the academic school year, so thank you for coming to hear my talk today. Before I get started talking about my research, I want to talk a little bit about the context around my professional kind of upbringing and kind of my philosophies. All right, so the first thing I want to say is that teachers have the best intentions. And I think everybody in this room knows that teachers are under fire right now, right? So we're kind of in a time where teachers are blamed for a lot of things that really they should not be blamed for. And teaching is not like a glorious profession to go into necessarily anyway, and now we're under fire for a lot of things. So before I get into what I'm going to talk about today with my presentation, I just want to make it clear that this is my belief, that teachers always have the best intentions. So teachers don't purposely use ineffective practices, right? So no teacher is going to say, I'm going to use this practice that doesn't work and hurt kids, right? So that's one thing I always keep in mind when I'm doing my research. And then based on my own experiences, I remember leaving my undergraduate program, and I thought that I knew everything that there was to know about being a great teacher. So I went into my first job, and I'm like, I'm ready. I'm going to conquer the world with my highly effective teaching. How many of you did that? Yeah? And then it only took me about a month to realize that I still had a whole heck of a lot to learn about becoming a good teacher. In addition to we do the best we can in preparing pre-service teachers, which is a big part of my job. I work a lot with our special education teacher candidates. We can spend all of this time teaching best practices and evidence-based practices, and those terms, we can debate what those terms mean as well. But they might get into a school, and the context of the school or the climate of the school might be such that they aren't able to implement those practices. Okay, so just kind of a disclaimer that my belief is that all teachers have the best intentions. Okay, another kind of hot topic I think in our field is which curriculum or which program or which practice or which method is the most effective? Like, what's the golden standard? And my belief is there are lots of great curricula that are available, and today I'm going to talk about just one program. So this one program, you'll see, was effective for some of the kids in my study, but there were certainly limitations to that program, and there are limitations to any curriculum and any program. And it's really, at the end of the day, it's really about what is going to be right for this kid at this time, in this context, and not one thing will work with every child, okay? So I know sometimes in our different kind of camps and silos, we have the tendency to really stick up for the things that we value the most, but I try to stay open-minded and think there's not one magic bullet, right? So context matters. And then in special education and applied behavior analysis, which is the program that I come from here at Ohio State, my colleagues and I specialize in single subject design. How many of you have heard of single subject design? that is very, very promising, because if I would have asked that question probably, I don't know, 10 years ago when I started, nobody in the room would have raised their hand. So just a bit of context about single subject design methodology. So we use the individual as the unit of analysis. And we are, within our designs, we identify and measure observable, measurable behaviors. Oftentimes, the person doing the research is also the person that's implementing the intervention or doing the assessment, and we're collecting data on an ongoing basis so that we can react to the data and we can see if we need to make immediate changes. So I think that our design is, or our methodology is really good, and I think that it provides one piece of the puzzle. So I guess what I'm saying at the end of the day, and one of the things I've loved about these First Friday series, is I've been able to hear how others approach research, which is, I think, a really valuable tool. And I think all the research that we do answers one piece of the puzzle, and all research is valuable to answer specific types of questions. So just wanted to give that kind of disclaimer with our research. As a former teacher, and now as a researcher, my approach has always been, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. So today I'm going to talk about an existing program. I didn't want to come up with something completely new. I didn't want to try to market this new approach that I created, and it's, you know, I think that we already have enough things available, enough tools available for teachers. And as a former teacher, I just wanted somebody to hand me something and say, try this out, see if it works. So that was the approach that I took with my own research. Teachers are very busy people. How many of you were teachers before? Okay, there were never enough hours in the day to create everything from scratch, right? So I'm going to talk about an existing program today that I researched. So what led me to study content area vocabulary instruction for high school students with disabilities is I was a high school intervention specialist, and you know, we all know that by the time students get to high school, if they have struggled with reading, they are far, far behind their peers, and it's almost impossible to close the gap. So it was always challenging for me as a high school intervention specialist to try to address the content in high school to help them keep up with that content, because that content is so specialized and it's so detailed and it's so difficult and challenging, but then still remediate reading skills. So that's why I was interested in this topic, and that's what led me down this particular line of research. Recently, I have started a new line of research looking at strategies to help pre-service teachers maintain and generalize what they learn in their training programs to the school. So now I've kind of shifted from a teacher perspective to an educator preparation perspective. Okay, so now that I've given the context of where I'm coming from, and in some ways some disclaimers, because I didn't want the group to think that I was just saying that this one approach would work well with every child. I'll get into the actual research. So we all know vocabulary is an essential component of reading instruction, along with phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. So we know vocabulary development is critical to student success in reading. Vocabulary is strongly related to general reading achievement, and vocabulary knowledge can impact the lifelong learning trajectory. I'm sure most of you in this room are familiar with the Hart and Risley study. So we know as early as birth through 3, the amount of language or the amount of vocabulary words that children are exposed to can impact their learning much later. Students who have poor vocabulary development are less likely to develop knowledge through independent reading, which leads to the Matthew effect. So good readers will read a lot more. They'll be exposed to a lot more vocabulary, which means that their vocabulary knowledge is a lot more extensive, right? So the students that I worked with, and the students that I specialize in working with, are students who were not good readers, and they read a lot less. Therefore, they were exposed to a lot less words, and their vocabulary knowledge was much smaller. So it's a really vicious cycle, and and research indicates that the gap between vocabulary knowledge for good readers and poor readers is quite substantial. So you guys probably remember middle school and high school having those really complex textbooks that you had to read independently. And those textbooks are really important because they include all of the specialized vocabulary terms that really held the most meaning in the content areas. I'm trying to think back to my chemistry class. I mean, that was a challenging class for me because of the content and because of the level I was expected to learn independently. So for our students that struggle, this can become quite overwhelming. So how are high school students typically taught vocabulary? That's a question that I'm posing to the group. Think back to your days. What did you have to do? What did your teachers do? Yes?
I think we just had key words when they were learning different units. And it was just know what the key words mean.
Okay, so you were given keywords. Were you given definitions?
Possibly, or maybe we had to like go find them in the textbook and figure out what they meant, or even like look in the glossary.
Okay, so I'm hearing looking them up in the glossary, looking them up in a dictionary. Any other approaches?
This might not be typical, but we had little workbooks. I remember it must have been junior or senior year. It might have been prep for, standardized testing.
Mhm.
They were like little workbooks where then you'd fill in the blank, or you'd do synonyms, or you'd do antonyms or something. So we actually had something explicit
Good.
like that.
Excellent. Okay, good. That's another good example. Anything else? What do you do now if you encounter a vocabulary word in like a research article that you don't know the meaning of the word? Yes.
It's also just kind of embedded, like you're supposed to, if you're just reading the textbook and you come across, like you said, if you don't know the word, you just kind of try and figure it out by context clues, and then.
I did not pay her to say any of this. Okay, so it's still relatively common in high school for vocabulary to be addressed through asking students to look up the definitions in the dictionary or glossary, and I remember doing that all the time. History was I think the one that we did it the most in. And then using context clues to figure out the meaning of words. So a lot of good readers can do this very quickly and easily and fluently. But what about our students that struggle with reading? All right, so those approaches, they require a lot of really complex prerequisite skills, right? So in order to be able to look something up in the dictionary, you have to be able to decode a word pretty easily, right? In order to figure out the context of, or to figure out the meaning of a word based on the context of the sentence, you have to have strategies to do that. You have to be able to deconstruct the sentence and look at sentences around the sentence. So our students that struggle with reading, these are not necessarily the most effective approaches, right? So learning from context depends on these skills that the reader has to have and the type of text. And I already said this, students who struggle with reading may not be able to do this independently. They might not have the prerequisite skills. Okay, so how do we approach this problem? So one possible solution, many studies have consistently found that teaching vocabulary through a direct instruction method in the younger grades is really effective. And there's a wealth of research on direct instruction in general as far as teaching reading skills, but specific to vocabulary. There are studies to support that if you can teach vocabulary in a very systematic way to young children, it's beneficial. Now, direct instruction is not really used a lot in high school, right? So there's a lot of stigma around using a direct instruction approach in high school because by the time kids get to high school, we expect them to be really independent, right? Because we're preparing them to enter the real world. But the problem with that approach is they don't, again, always have those prerequisite skills. So there are recommendations based on meta-analyses for how to approach teaching vocabulary to adolescents, and that includes direct instruction of word meaning through a variety of activities to reinforce vocabulary knowledge. So it sounds like that was an approach that you were exposed to. You had a variety of activities to get the practice. And then instruction of strategies to promote independent vocabulary acquisition. So there's been a decent amount of research to support strategy instruction as far as morphemic analysis, where we teach kids the meaning of word parts, and then they can generalize their knowledge of the word parts to novel words, but there's not a lot of research to support the usage of like a prepackaged direct instruction curricula on students' vocabulary knowledge. So that leads me to my study. Okay, I'm doing okay on time? Okay. Well, I've been practicing and I've been right at time, so I think we'll be good. So my research questions for this particular study: is direct instruction of vocabulary effective in helping high school students with reading disabilities learn science vocabulary words per lesson? Is direct instruction effective in helping them maintain vocabulary knowledge over time? So we know that maintenance and generalization with students with disabilities is an area that teachers often struggle to make sure their students maintain and generalize what they learn. So they might effectively learn something up front, but can they maintain it over time? And I wanted to get at that last point that I made as far as there's this kind of a stigma around using direct instruction in a high school setting. And I wanted to know, do the kids like it? Like, do they think it's completely, ridiculous, and is it boring? Is it, killing their creativity? Or do they actually like the approach? Okay. So the study took place in a large suburban high school, and I use that term with caution because this high school is a really, really unique high school, and it has, it's just located in a really unique area, and it's a highly diverse school. So I don't think of it as a typical suburban school. I think it's really a mixture of suburban, urban, and rural. But the technical classification was suburban. 64% of the students in the school were considered to be economically disadvantaged, so pretty high percent. And then 17% of the students qualified for special education services. So most of you know that the national average, and what's typical of a school, is 12% of your students qualify for special education. So this school had a slightly higher percentage of kids that needed those services. Okay. In order to be included in the study, the participants had to be reading at least a third grade level. And the reason that criterion was chosen is because the program that I use, that I'll talk about in a moment, that's a prerequisite of the program. So if a child or if a student, I can't say child because we're talking about high school kids. If a student is reading below the third grade level, then they won't be able to access the instruction in the program I'm going to talk about, and they won't have the prerequisite skills to be successful. They had to be eligible for special ed services under the category of specific learning disability. They had to be receiving special education services in the resource room for at least part of the day, and they had to be working on IEP goals and objectives to address reading. Okay, now, before I talk about my participants, I just want to say I let them choose their names, their pseudonyms for the research study. So my first participant's name is particularly relevant right now. And it's funny because I actually did this study a few years ago before LeBron left Cleveland. So it's just interesting. It's all coming back full circle now. So LeBron was a black male in the 12th grade at the time of this study. Becky was a white female in the 11th grade, and Mo was a white male in the 11th grade. So I was working with juniors and seniors. I originally had a fourth participant who had to drop out of the study, and that became one of the limitations of the study that I'll talk about later. The content that we targeted for this study included science. The reason we chose science, if those of you that know about the Ohio graduation test, you're shaking your heads already. Science seemed to be the real bugaboo for a lot of schools. That was the area that a lot of schools had like lower pass rates. So we chose science because it seemed logical to target an area that was going to help the kids on something that was high stakes for them. Sessions occurred in a small group setting in an isolated area of the library. I was the person that was delivering, implementing the intervention. I was doing work at the school at the time, so it made sense to kind of break the group up. And the sessions occurred during resource room class periods, and the sessions occurred 3 days per week for 60 minutes per session. So I do want to say that I was the person implementing the intervention, but I was not the teacher of record. So these were not kids that were assigned to me, and they were not kids on my caseload. All right, so we used a single subject alternating treatment design, which means that we assigned the participants to one of two conditions, and then we alternated the conditions. So they never received the same type of condition twice in a row. And the reason that we had them assigned to different conditions was to control for the difficulty of the lessons and the assessment. So if there was a lesson or an assessment that was really like not typical of the other assessments, we'd be able to see that in the data. Okay. Several dependent variables. I'll explain each one of these individually. So let's start with the cumulative gain scores per lesson. This is the main measure for the study. This was the measure that we were looking at the most. So given that we wanted to kind of compare two conditions, we wanted to see which condition did the students learn more per lesson. So we're all about student growth and education right now. And it made sense to use this calculation rather than just a regular percent correct, because this calculation controls for things that the students might have known before the instruction occurred. So for each lesson, we gave a pre-test and a post-test. The first assessment had 15 new words, and then from the second assessment on, the assessments included like 12 to 13 new words plus 2 to 3 maintenance words, so we could measure maintenance in an ongoing way. So basically these assessments were a piece of paper that had the targeted vocabulary term, and then the participants had to write the definition after the term. Once they completed these assessments, the researchers had an answer key, and on the answer key, a full definition was included, and we highlighted what we called key elements of the definition. So those key elements were non-negotiable. Those were the things that had to be included for the participants to get credit for their definition. All right, so once we administered these pre and post assessments, and we had those data, we would do the post-assessment number correct for the lesson minus the pre-assessment number correct for the lesson, divided by the total number of new words for the lesson, minus the pre-assessment number correct for the lesson times 100. Do you need a minute? It's kind of a long formula. So essentially, we're just taking out the items that they already knew before we taught them. Okay? Okay, for ongoing maintenance, as I mentioned on the previous slide, each lesson assessment had 2 or 3 words that were taught in previous lessons. So we would take these words, we would check them for correctness in the same way that we did for the other assessment I just talked about. And at the end of the study, we took just kind of a total percentage, like how many maintenance words did they get correct in this condition, how many maintenance words did they get correct in this condition. So that was the ongoing maintenance. But then we also had a long-term maintenance measure where we gave this big pre-assessment before the study started and a big post-assessment at the end of the study. And it had a sample of words from the curriculum. So it was not like kind of a standardized test. It was a curriculum-based test. For the long-term maintenance, we, again, calculated cumulative gain scores per condition. All right, for inter-observer agreement, we did a total agreement calculation. So it was not an exact agreement where we compared each item, but at the end of the assessment, we would say we had this many agreements and this many disagreements. And from that, we would calculate a percentage of agreement. Procedural integrity, for every single session, the primary researcher completed a procedural integrity checklist. And then for 40% of the sessions, a second observer came in and independently completed the same checklist. So the standard in our field is 30%, and your observer agreement is what you need to aim for at minimum. So we tried to go above for the IOA within this study. So we agreed that all steps were completed accurately for both conditions 100% of the time. At the very end of the study, we gave a social validity survey that included 6 questions. 3 of those questions were Likert scale questions, and then the other 3 were more narrative, open-ended questions. Okay, now we're going to get into what the conditions were. I call this different things, so it might be confusing. Here I'm calling it baseline, and the graph you'll see it's called traditional instruction. So for our baseline or traditional instruction method, we modeled the instruction, I say instruction loosely because it was more independent learning. We modeled that condition after the approaches that were being used within their classroom. So the things that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, they were asked to look up definitions in the dictionary and the glossary. They were asked to figure out the meaning of words based on the context. And so they read the passage. They had to write down any words they didn't know. They had to use those methods to find the definition. And then they could engage in additional independent reading on that topic. So really independent. But in order to control for the time that they're exposed to the material, we made sure that the conditions were the same length of time. The intervention that we used was direct instruction lessons from the Rewards Plus science program. Is anybody familiar with Rewards? Yes, okay. Okay, so this is part of the reason I wanted to study this program, because even though it's not relatively new anymore, it is being used in some schools, and it does have an evidence base to support its effectiveness with certain populations at certain times, like we were talking about. But it's still not like widely known. So within the Rewards Plus program, and there's multiple rewards programs that you can use, within the one that we used, the vocabulary instruction included pre-teaching of vocabulary before reading the passage. So introducing the word, introducing the definition, and then kind of quizzing students on the word. So they had practice before they even encountered the words in the passages. Then they were asked to read a passage out loud, and there were embedded comprehension questions within the passage that included reference to the vocabulary terms. Then there was a post-reading comprehension activity that included questions with the vocabulary terms. And then they had to do yes, no, why, and completion activities. So an example of that would be, they would be given a statement like, a proton is an atom with a negative charge. And they had to say yes, no, and then why. So in that case, it would be no, because a proton, did I say negative? A proton is an atom with a positive charge, right? So it made them really think critically about the word and evaluate the statement. Okay, now we get to talk about the really fun stuff. So here are the results. We'll start with Becky. And before I talk specifically about her results, in single subject alternating treatment design, what we're really looking for is a separation between the two conditions. So if there's a functional relation, or a functional relation is suggested, then there won't be overlap between the lines. There's a clear separation between the conditions, and then we always look at the trend data. Are there upward trends? Are there downward trends? So in Becky's case, we see that there is separation between the conditions, but we also see that there's a downward trend in the direct instruction toward the end of the study, and a little bit of an upward trend in the traditional kind of independent baseline condition. As far as Becky, she started to miss a lot of sessions toward the end of the study. She was out sick a lot, so we were going a long time in between assessments. I don't know if that impacted the data or not. That's just an anecdotal observation. All right, you can see for LeBron, within his data, we see really the most evidence of a functional relation between direct instruction and cumulative gain scores per lesson. So these are the lesson assessments where we calculated how much they learned in the lesson. So not only is there a clear separation between the conditions, there is an upward trend in direct instruction and kind of a downward trend in traditional instruction. Okay. Here we have Mo's data. Yeah, it was really fun to look at his responses on that test because it's just one of those, those teacher moments where you just like, you just feel so bad for your student because he had the perfect definitions for proton, neutron, and electron. Perfect. beautiful textbook, but he attached them to the wrong words. So that is one explanation for the data point that is overlapping. So he just totally bombed the test because of his perfect definitions were attached to the wrong word. But I think that's an interesting conversation, though, because, I mean, that really demonstrates that he truly did not learn the words, right? So it's accurate. I think it's an accurate point related to his knowledge. Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Because children aren't like, I mean, I raised 2 children.
Right.
They have bad days. I mean, a snapshot, it doesn't mean that he just,
Right.
He could have broken up with his girlfriend. I mean, any number, he could have a
Right.
fight with mom or dad. I mean, any number of things. He may not have had breakfast. I mean, the rest are so good. It's just
I
he had
know.
a bad day, in my opinion. It's
Right.
not he didn't learn that week or that lesson.
Right.
Okay? And that's an alternative explanation. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened.
Well, you're right, and that's my next point with this graph is other than this data point, there would have been clear separation between the 2 conditions. So, but it's always fun to talk about these things because this is real. This is applied research. We're working with real kids, right? So I think.
It's every high stakes test that's
Right.
based upon one day. It could be the
Right.
worst day of their high school existence.
That's right. We all know high school students have a lot of drama.
Correct.
Oh, sure.
So, you have the, can you remind me what a traditional instruction is? Just like
The direct instruction,
the traditional.
oh, the traditional. So that's where they were given the reading passage from the rewards program. They had to read it independently, and they had to identify words that were important vocabulary words that they didn't know. And then they had to look up the definitions in the dictionary or glossary, or figure out the meaning of the word based on the context of the sentence. So the reason that I structured it that way is because that's very common, that's a very common approach. That's what was already occurring in the setting. So it's not really a surprise that there's a difference between the 2 conditions, and that's why I want to give another kind of disclaimer that I consider this to be more of a demonstration study. And it's just the first step in looking at, this program.
And for the direct, you gave them you knew the definitions before, you kind of trained them in the concept definitions previous to them reading the passage. And
That's right. That's right.
One day the direct instruction, the other one traditional.
Yes. Yep, so they alternated between the 2 conditions. We always had at least 1 student in one condition, 1 or 2 in one condition, and then 1 and 2 in the other condition. So I mentioned that I had a 4th participant that dropped out. Ideally, we would have had 2 in each condition at all time, just to kind of control for the difficulty of the assessments. Yes?
What constituted knowing a definition? Was it in the format of a closed test?
No, they were given an assessment with the key vocabulary words. And then there was a blank space after the words, and they had to write a definition. So we would compare their responses to an answer key, and if they had an exact match to the definition, or if they had the key elements of the definition, then it was marked as correct. So the key elements were, like I said, the non-negotiables. Like they had to use that word to demonstrate that they really knew what the word was. It was a written test, yep, which is, yeah. Yes. Yep.
Do you have any of the graphs more like chronological so you can see the data points where this child had this lesson in direct instruction first, and here's what they had, and then they had this lesson with the traditional, and they're so you can see how.
Oh, so just looking at like numbers per day, or?
So they had each lesson, unless I'm just seeing that wrong. So lesson 1 for this person, lesson 1 was in direct instruction.
Yeah.
Lesson 2 is a different topic, but they received it in traditional.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yep.
okay. So each lesson is a different topic.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Did they get partial points for definitions?
Nope. It was all or nothing. Yep. And it's so I keep kicking myself because I always choose to try to measure writing samples, which is really, really difficult. So we agreed before we even started the study, like, we have to agree on these key elements before we even get started, so there's just no debate. Because anytime you're scoring writing samples, it can become very subjective very quickly. So we were really, really rigorous with our approach and our procedures. So, but there were times we were scoring things and we're like, oh, so close. Like, can't we just kind of count that? But no, we didn't do that. Yep. Okay. Here's just another way to look at the cumulative gain score data. I just reported the ranges and the means per condition. So for Becky, the range was 0 to 20 with a mean of 6.6. In traditional, for direct, it was 30 to 57 with a mean of 42.8%. So there's a pretty big difference in the mean there. For LeBron, in traditional, a range of 0 to 14 with a mean of 4.4. For direct, a range of 30 to 90 and a mean of 58.8. So again, pretty big difference, and thus far, this approach has been most effective for LeBron. And I was kicking myself on the way here. Oh, you're going to cut me off. I was kicking myself on the way here this morning because one thing I did forget to include was a table about their current reading levels. So this is a really important piece of information. LeBron was reading at the lowest level. So he was just barely like meeting the criterion for being included in this study. So that's another really important implication that we can talk about. Mo for the traditional instruction, 0 to 18% with a mean of 9%, and then direct, 0 to 81%, he had a bad day, and a mean of 45.8%. All right, let's look at the maintenance data. This is really important because maintenance is so difficult and it's really important. So students haven't really learned a word unless they can maintain it over time. So this is one of the limitations of this program. So for Becky, for ongoing maintenance, there's not that much of a difference between traditional and direct. And this is where we calculated a percent correct at the very end of the study. For long-term maintenance, nothing for direct. She was able to get nothing from the direct instruction condition, and then just a little bit from the traditional. LeBron, again, there's evidence to show that this was a pretty good approach for him. So there is a difference between the traditional and the direct. What's that? Are you laughing about the name, LeBron? Oh, we do love LeBron. And then for long term, there was a difference again. So for Mo, not as clear. I mean, there is a difference, but his maintenance just was low overall. And actually, if you look at all three of the participants, that's problematic that they were only able to maintain very low percentages of what they learned. Yes?
I was going to ask about those maintenance words, because it was always that there were words that they learned before that were tested in that session. So
Right.
were the words taught over both the direct and instructional and then could have been assessed? Right. They were assessed they were assessed ongoing.
There was an ongoing measure and a
Right. So the ongoing one,
Uh-huh.
either of them, but the words were either taught in traditional or direct.
Right,
They
right.
could have been taught in both.
correct,
Yeah.
correct, yes, yep.
The question was, I don't understand how you calculated the ongoing versus the long term.
Yeah.
How
Okay, so for the ongoing, on each one of those lesson assessments, starting after the first assessment, because there wasn't anything to maintain after, before we started. So from assessment 2 to 10, we included 2 or 3 words from previously taught lessons. And then we knew which words they were exposed to in traditional, we knew which words they were exposed to in direct. So we just kept track over time. They got this word correct, this word incorrect, and then at the end, we calculated total percentage that they maintained on those lesson assessments per condition. The long-term maintenance measure was a big pre-test and a big post-test with a sample of all the words. So they had to remember the definition for a lot longer.
And was the long-term one, when you gave the post-test, was there any sort of break after the last lesson, or was it almost directly, was there like some time in between doing the last lesson and the
Yeah, there was probably about a week. Like I kind of gave them a break from me for a little bit before I went and did all the final measures, yeah. But that's a good point, because then is that truly a measure of long-term maintenance for that last lesson? So, yeah. Okay. Our inter-observer agreement, excuse me. So going back to some of the challenges with scoring writing samples. There were some times when we had low agreements, and part of it was the training process. So we know after time with inter-observer agreement, you have inter-observer drift, right? So we were supposed to be really stringent, like I said, and it was yes, no, but then if you're not the researcher that's the primary researcher that's really involved in the study, then there's drift over time with how you start scoring things. And then the median for, first I reported how many lessons we did inter-observer agreement on, and we did it on almost all the assessments. And then here's the range of agreement. So there was one time that we had kind of low agreement with Mo, and then I reported the median scores. So overall, it's really, it met the standards of single subject design. Here's the inter-observer agreement for the pre and post assessments. So pretty high. Social validity. All of the participants reported that direct instruction was more effective in helping them learn the vocabulary, more enjoyable. It was the method that they would prefer using in the future, so that was encouraging. What would you change? We asked them, what would you change about the traditional, the non-direct instruction? LeBron said, it's hard, but I can do it. I think that this comment really captures some of the struggles that our high school students face, right? So could he do it? What did our graph say? No, he couldn't do it at all, right? So a lot of our high school students may think, like, this is really hard, but I'm doing okay. I'm just fine. He was not just fine in this condition. So nobody said that they would change anything about the direct instruction. Any additional comments? They had a chance to just add additional comments. LeBron said, this helped me with words I needed to know. Some of them were on the OGT, which was true, so that was encouraging. That's a good measure of social validity. And Mo said it was fun. So, not really relevant to the instruction, but thank you for the reinforcement, Mo. It's at least good to know that when you have participants in a study, they're not miserable. Okay, discussion. So this indicates that, especially for LeBron, this is a viable method to help kind of boost his vocabulary. There was the most evidence of a functional relation occurred between lesson assessments and cumulative gain scores, so that first set of graphs that I showed you. The difference in conditions was more evident in the ongoing maintenance data than the long-term maintenance, but they didn't maintain it very well, regardless of the condition. LeBron did the best, but still, this is problematic because a word's not really learned until you can maintain it. And there's literature to indicate that it can take up to 40 repetitions, 40 exposures to a word before a child with a disability can fully know it. So we did not track how many times they were exposed to the words in each condition. I think that would be a really interesting study to look at in the future, is to track, like they were exposed to the word 40 times in direct instruction and 40 times in, independent learning instruction, whatever. All right, so we had an imbalance between groups because we lost a participant. It would have been nice to have 2 in each condition. And I do recognize that the baseline condition in this study was very unstructured. And like I said, I chose to do it that way for this initial study as more of a demonstration. But I think in future studies, it would be interesting to kind of compare it to a more structured approach. So our inter-observer agreement for a few of the assessments was a little bit lower than we would have liked. The curriculum-based assessments that we used had the students write responses, and writing always opens up a whole can of worms when you're scoring it. The study was short. We only got through 10 lessons. The rewards program is actually 15 lessons long, but we had to cut it short because of the end of the school year. And there was a lack of alignment between the words that were taught in the rewards curriculum and the words that they were being taught in their actual science class. So that could have been another reason that maintenance was not so hot in the study, because they weren't being exposed to the words in different settings, and that would have kind of bumped up how many times they were exposed to the words. Okay, so future studies compare it to more structured curricula or method. We only use curriculum-based assessments in this study. So it'd be interesting, and actually there has been some research on the rewards program that's been more kind of group design research that's used standardized assessments. These are just preliminary findings. So more research is needed, especially on the Rewards Plus program. Most of the rewards research was related to the initial programs that they offer. Okay, we need more time. As researchers, we always need more time, right? More time, more participants. Linking the words to what's going on in the actual classroom. That's all I got. Okay, thanks. That was under time.